time or space. We think through the decades and through centuries as we have progressed, we think human rights, our conception of human rights, have always expanded to include more and more people. In the past, women didn't have the same rights as the men deserved, and now we see a rise of gender equality, a rise, in fact, of movements encouraging and demanding the same rights, exact rights that men have for women. In the past, we had things like slaves, where they didn't have the right to movement. Sometimes, it didn't even have the right to their own lives or the right from the freedom from physical harm. And yet today, we have abolished this entire trait of slavery, and we have moved on to include these people and to also accord these same human rights that they deserve to them. Similarly, we think in today's debate, we have to understand that the conception of human rights is often flexible. That is often when we find a need to, or we find that when there's a need to, we can in fact extend this conception to include more groups of people, more groups of beings. And in this case, as a proposition, we are going to say that primates and dolphins both deserve and need these human rights that we should and can accord to them. No, thank you. So what exactly do we mean by these kinds of rights? So briefly talking about, right, on-site proposition, when we allow them the same rights to life, we will simply criminalize the murder of these primates and dolphins. And similarly, we think the government also needs to go a step further, which means that the government then needs to enable this right to life for these primates and dolphins. So do things such as helping the ecosystem, helping to build their habitat, things like that, which enable the right to life. No, thank you. Freedom from physical harm, simply, if you harm a primate or dolphin without proper reason, without if it is not self-defense, then similarly, you can be brought to court and put in jail. No, thank you, sir. Lastly, freedom of movement. We think on our side, you will simply free them from zoos. They will be allowed to go out and not be trapped within a limited space where their freedom of movement is being curtailed. So if any of these three rights are being infringed for these primates and dolphins, we will simply bring them to court, and the courting punishments will be met out. No, thank you, sir. So on that proposition, we are going to give you four main arguments. As first leader, I'm going to tell you how, first of all, we need to expand this conception of human rights to include primates and dolphins, and secondly, how we ensure justice is done to these primates and dolphins. For my second speaker is then going to tell you how this, firstly, creates a more humane society, and last of all, how we also empower the government to make and create a more consistent moral stance. So I'm going to move on now to my first argument, but before that, yes.
Would you make it a moral and legal duty for a man to jump into the river to save a drowning baboon?
So I think this is completely different from what we are trying to talk about. I think in the first place, this is the idea of whether or not you have a need to do a good Samaritan act just because someone else there is suffering and potentially going to die. We think this is a completely separate debate. We're not going to talk about those kinds of things in our debate. So I'm going to move on now to my first argument about how we should expand the conception of human rights to include these primates and dolphins. Ultimately, why do we distinguish primates and dolphins from all other kinds of animals, such as dogs, such as cockroaches or lizards? We think what is special and unique about primates and dolphins is that they have sentience, right? They are as research has shown us, they are able to identify themselves in mirrors. They have social hierarchies, they have social structures within their species, and they are able to have that kind of social bonds that similarly, as humans, we are able to create with the people and the families around us. So on this count, we think based on sentience, based on the idea that they have that same kind of criteria, that qualification that all other humans have when we call ourselves humans, we think similarly, this kind of rights that we have should be extended to include them as well. We see an increasing trend, right, of this happening when the EU has implemented the Treaty of Amsterdam, which in fact institutionalizes animal rights and prevents people from killing them or harming them without proper reason. Ultimately, we think this idea that based on sentience we should be according these rights to them is something that is increasingly being accepted, and we need to make this more universal. No, thank you. Furthermore, we think the way of life of these primates are often in potential of being severely curtailed when they don't have this right to protection, which means that now the zookeepers or other people are simply able to do whatever they want to them or take away their right to life, when you simply kill a dolphin or kill a primate within the zoo, and we don't think this is fair for them, and they're unable to have any means of recourse or any means of protecting themselves in this area. Furthermore, we think that even if on that opposition, they're going to come up and tell us that this is in fact very arbitrary. We think that often when how we distinguish or how we decide where exactly to draw the line to give certain people or certain individuals rights over others, it is often very arbitrary. But in fact, on our side of opposition, we argue that it is always better in fact to be more inclusive, right? That ultimately, because we have established the basic premise that these primates and dolphins have sentience and therefore are very similar to human beings, then we should be inclusive and ensure that our rights, that our standards are consistent, and we also accord these rights to these primates and dolphins. Yes?
Can you give me a precise definition of the meaning of sentience?
So I just gave you many examples, right, of what it means when an individual or these beings have sentience. For example, they are able to identify themselves by things like face recognition, things like being able to recognize each other, things like having a social structure and hierarchies, social bonds within these societies. Ultimately, this idea that they are not just meaningless, unthinking beings is not present, and is not the case for these particular beings like primates and dolphins. Everything based on that, ultimately we should be according them these rights that we also accord human beings when we say that a human being is a human being because he has sentience. So having proof in the first account that because ultimately these primates and dolphins also fulfill the same kind of
information,
according to which we accord these people, we accord them a right, therefore we should be giving them these kinds of rights. Furthermore, my second argument now, which is that we ensure that justice is being done to them. First of all, we think that we can acknowledge, right, that so our society or human society is in fact more advanced, which means that what happens often is that there is often a lot of harm that is done to these primates and dolphins when we infringe on the ecosystem, infringe on their way of life, because we think that all those animals out there are just simply to serve us, right, to serve our enjoyment. They should be put in zoos and kept in cages and locked up just so that we can identify what are dolphins or what are primates and all these kinds of animals. Ultimately, we think our society also has this kind of idea or this concept that we should be protecting the vulnerable, and we think that this is already present in status quo, where we have many safeguards and many checks and balances to ensure that those who are vulnerable, those who are perhaps less mental IQ or perhaps those who are more physically unable, should be protected because we should be protecting them and we should be helping the vulnerable. No, thank you. So on the first account, we think that these beings need protection and we should be willing and encouraging individuals to extend this kind of protection to giving them human rights. On the second account, we think that often, as I've said earlier, harm is done to these primates and yet they're unable to do anything in return. We don't think that primates or these dolphins do harm to other people just because they want to do harm. Often they do so, they go into our places, like they go into the city and all that, because their ecosystem and their forests are being cut down and they simply don't have anywhere to go. We think that often this kind of harm, irretrievably and irreparable harm that is done to the primates and dolphins is overlooked simply because they are seen as inferior beings. Ultimately, we think that we need to give these individuals and these primates and dolphins the ability, right, to be able to stand up for themselves and to be able to be free from these kinds of harm and be protected. Ultimately, if you are talking about self-defense, then sure, right, if a primate attacks you without any proper reason, perhaps yes, you can defend yourself. But when an individual or when a human being attacks the primate without any initiation of an attack by the primate, we think it's fundamentally unfair and unjust, and justice isn't just something that stands for us superior beings like human beings. These are concepts and ideas that have to be universalized and should also be extended to animals.